Welcome to Psyphilopod. This week,
Psyphilopod. How many times do I have to tell you?
I don't
It's
even
like
know how to pronounce.
cephalopod, but
I know, I
psyphilopod.
always say, okay, so you can say that. This week, per usual, I'm broadcasting from an undisclosed location in Marietta, Ohio, because I'm a professor, assistant style at Marietta, Ohio. And this is my partner in crime.
Cory Clark, and I'm assistant professor of social psychology at Durham University in Great Britain.
Yes, and this week we are talking about punishment and righteousness, and we are calling our episode Fear Not the Selfish, Fear the Self Righteous.
Yes, something like that.
I thought that was it, but maybe that's
You
not.
might have botched it a little bit, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's possible that I botched it. Um, so, we're going to talk about punishment and the
Mm-hmm.
dangers of excessive punishment, especially on social media.
Self-righteous punishment, yeah.
Yes,
Twitter
especially with,
mobs, etc.
yes. So, yeah, before that, we want to talk about punishment in general, sort of the evolutionary function of punishment, the function of punishment from society, different kinds of punishment, etc. So, why don't you tell us the probably the distinction between the two most broadly recognized goals of punishment or types of punishment?
Yeah, so there are probably like four or five main types people talk about, but the two that I think are most relevant to this conversation are retribution versus what I'll just call utilitarian punishment. So retribution is considered to be largely motivated by like anger and just desire to see somebody suffer, um, whereas utilitarian punishment is punishment for the sake of making everybody, I suppose, better off at the end. So the person who committed the immoral act should be less likely to commit infractions in the future. Other people in society should observe this punishment and be less likely to commit similar infractions themselves. And I suppose a utilitarian would argue that you should really only punish insofar as it has other benefits for society.
Yeah, so what I would say is that retributive punishment, the suffering of the person who's getting punished, is a crucial part of the goal of
Yeah,
punishment.
so the just desserts, like the person,
Right.
right?
This is the idea that the person deserves his or her punishment, and therefore the suffering is part of the punishment. Whereas utilitarian punishment, the suffering is actually just an incidental uh, byproduct, really,
Mm-hmm.
of a process that's attempting to change the person's behavior, deter other people, etc. And in fact, the utilitarian might go so far as to say if you could somehow alter people's behaviors without causing pain, then that would be the more humane and the better way to do things. So you can
Right.
imagine, for example, if you had, let's say you had somebody who was who murdered, I don't know, 12 people, and that we had a pill that would,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is just silly, but consider the example, we had a pill that would immediately turn the person into a noble human. The utilitarian would say we should just give the person the pill and that would be good, whereas the retributive theorist would say no, we should punish the person and cause the person pain because they, like, literally in some metaphysical sense deserve the pain for their crimes.
Yeah, and what I don't actually know, how do you classify um, when you're trying to make the victim feel better? And
Yeah,
that seems like a utilitarian concern, but presumably the
right.
reason that the victim wants the other person to suffer is for retributive reasons. I mean, I guess these are like philosophies and they're not actually in practice. Punishment is both retributive and
Oh,
utilitarian, and it's
sure, because
impossible probably to isolate them in most real world cases.
yeah, because we would say that the reason you evolved the propensity to punish others, of
Mm-hmm.
course, is so that you could deter their behavior.
Like how so?
Because biological spite, for example, just that is just the sadistic desire in inflicting suffering on other organisms, doesn't enhance one's fitness. So it would, the idea that you would evolve just like spite doesn't make a lot of sense. So throughout evolutionary history, the desire for punishment generally correlated with deterrence
Mm-hmm.
or some other practical effect. So yes, it is actually in practice very difficult to distinguish between the two because the motivation that causes the desire for retribution
Mm-hmm.
also was related to
Right.
deterrence.
The entire reason we would evolve the desire
Right.
for retribution is because it had utility. Um,
Yes.
and there have been studies who tease these apart and show that people will say that they're utilitarians and people say they really care about deterrence because these make sense if you're trying to rationalize your punitive judgments and behaviors. But in fact, people will still happily punish other people um, when there could absolutely be no deterrent benefits or utilitarian benefits, if we want to call it that. Um, so people are retributive, but they want to think of themselves as utilitarians.
Yeah, so I suppose I'm just thinking about this. I suppose what one could say is that um, punishment in a certain sense, you could compare it to say sexual desire. So
Mm-hmm.
the reason we evolved sexual desire is because having sex correlated with having children. However, now we actually attempt to prevent ourselves from having children most of the time, right? And if we wanted to increase, especially if we're a male, if we want to increase our fitness, actually what we would do is donate sperm to sperm banks,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there you can make this distinction between the two, although they evolved together for the one evolved because it generally led to the other.
Right.
So
So it's
what
the
this would
proximate
suggest to
desire for punishment, like the proximate desire for
yes,
sex, for the ultimate purpose of preventing people from screwing you and your group over, and
yeah,
for having ultimate purpose of having children.
e-
Yeah.
exactly. And it seems to me that what that would suggest is people are going to be retributive, generally speaking, because the proximate desire is just this anger and this fulfillment at somebody else's suffering. That is wanting to inflict pain and suffering on other people is the proximate desire.
Mm-hmm.
And that would suggest that probably, although as you said, in modern studies, people claim to be utilitarian. I think
Right.
because they believe that's the answer they should give, because that
Yeah.
seems to be the rational
Seems more
answer.
humane or
Yeah. I think if you went back to, say, ancient Rome, they wouldn't even bother with that poppycock. They would just say, yeah, I want to cause suffering. Um,
maybe.
yeah. But that's a different
There
question, I suppose.
there's another benefit which I suppose I wanted to mention briefly, which is so obviously punishment is beneficial because it will prevent people from committing infractions against you or your group in the future. But there also appears to be this signaling function where if you're punishing other people, it's an indicator of your own moral goodness and trustworthiness. So when you condemn another person for doing something bad, you're telling other people that this is something I consider bad and I would never do it. So the person who does a lot of really cool work on this is Jillian Jordan, and she has all these studies showing that if you give people opportunities to signal their trustworthiness in other ways, then they're less likely to third party punish other people. Um, and that people who do third party punish are perceived as more trustworthy and, in fact, are more trustworthy. So you get these sort of immediate personal benefits, social status from other people, and other people find you more trustworthy if you condemn and punish other people.
So here's a
You look
question. What are
skeptical.
Well, I'm curious. I'm not actually familiar with that. I'm familiar with an article with, I know Paul Bloom's on an article that makes that
Jillian Jordan
argument.
is the lead author on that one.
Okay,
I'm
okay.
pretty sure.
Now, what were the other options for signaling their trustworthiness that they had?
I believe she
Do
has
you
at
know?
least two papers on this, and I'm trying to recall. I think one is offering to help someone in some way.
Okay, so this is, I think I'd have here's an interpretation of that I think would explain both effects, and it's possible that it's not a signal.
Okay.
Maybe I'm so another function of punishing, as we're talking about, is it enhances your status in a group somehow. Now, one argument is that what it does is it functions as a costly signal of your honesty or your commitment to the group, I suppose. But another thing that it actually does is it literally helps your group and therefore people reward you. And I'm not sure why you need signaling there. I mean, it's just actually immediately benefiting your group that if we're in a group of 10 people and Bob's willing to punish somebody who harmed our group, then we should reward him because that immediately benefits our group.
Yeah, so you're
So I guess I'm
saying
not sure
people
why
would
there need.
reward punishing behavior simply because now you're an asset to the rest of us,
Yes,
and we don't.
exactly.
I mean,
You're an asset
I
and we
think that's a
want
fine
you.
argument, but it could easily be both.
Oh, I agree with that, but I guess here's a maybe this is wrong, but I would think that you generally resort to a signaling explanation when you don't have another
Mm-hmm.
explanation, right? So, well, it's hard to explain this behavior unless we posit a signaling function. Here, it seems to me that if you think about it from this sort of coalitional value framework, how much are
Mm-hmm.
you adding to this coalition? Punishment it makes sense that you would get status from it just immediately because you're actually benefiting the group and the group wants to maintain you as a member.
But could the signaling function potentially have say something more about your long-term traits than individual cases of punishing? So you helped in this particular case. You punished this
Hmm.
person who harmed a member of your in-group.
Right.
You presumably can't do that all the time,
Sure.
whereas condemning other people might show something about maybe your moral principles. I don't know. I'm just making stuff up here.
Well, yeah, well, I think
Because you I think you want to explain too why a lot of punishment isn't punishment at all, and it's just kind of like declaring that you find things wrong, that you disapprove of someone's behavior,
right. So
which isn't that functional on its own or
no, see,
costly.
I think it's very functional, and that's I think I don't know if we want to get into this now, but let me just mark this. I think most people's analysis of so-called virtue signaling is
Mm-hmm.
misguided. I don't mean that in a condescending way. I think it's an interesting idea, but I think it's wrong. I think it's not virtue signaling so much as it's commitment signaling. It's signaling that I'm committed to this kind of a tribe because
Mm-hmm.
what morals are basically ways of being tribal. You say I believe these morals, therefore I inhabit this tribe. So if you loudly proclaim on Twitter or television or elsewhere that I have these moral values and you've run afoul of them, you're proclaiming your fidelity to a certain tribe.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that that's in that way you can see why it doesn't really have to be costly because in the same way that I can wear an NPR cup and show that I'm sort of in the liberal tribe or something, so I
Mm-hmm.
can chastise you for being pro-choice and show that I'm in the conservative clique.
Yeah, I mean, people signal their virtue about all kinds of things that aren't linked to obvious group membership, but I suppose maybe
Such
your
as
like basic infractions that like anybody would find morally wrong, like a drunk dude kicking a cat on a video.
Yeah, but okay, but there you're if you don't emit the punishment signal, that is, if you just walk insouciantly by somebody who's kicking a cat,
It's not
then
that, it's not, opting not to post a tweet about how much of a jerk this guy is for kicking a cat.
right, but the tweet is coming from this motivation that you have to scold people for committing moral infractions, right? So like,
Yeah, but there's no
I think,
tribal component of that. That's
but
just
but okay, right,
that's
but what I'm
pure
saying is there is.
morality.
No, no, see, I disagree because
Okay.
you're showing that you're a member of the community of decent people. You're a member of the community of people who would scold somebody for doing that. Now imagine that imagine that you didn't experience any moral discomfort when walking past a guy kicking a cat. It would hurt your status. People would think that you don't share their moral values, don't you think?
I mean, it's a little bit different now. Like, I don't think anyone notices when someone doesn't comment on a cat kicking
No, no, no.
video, but
No. I know. I'm saying
but
the
yeah,
motive.
historically,
Right.
if
So therefore, the motivation, right, is what I'm talking about.
yeah, if you really
Yeah.
didn't care.
Right. No, I
Yeah, I
agree
mean,
with you.
those
You don't
explanations might be hard to,
disentangle.
yeah.
Yeah. Agreed with that.
Hmm.
Agreed. So we don't know if punishment is really a signal. So
We
there's
don't
one
know.
empirical question. I say only resort to signaling if you have to. And then two, we don't know if it's really a virtue signal or
Why
if
is
it's
that
a
a principle,
tribal
though?
signal.
Why can't it just be if the signal would be beneficial to the self, then people would do it? Why does that have to be a last resort explanation?
Well, I guess if you can explain a behavior without positing a signaling function, then the signaling seems superfluous, I guess. Right, so like you don't have to posit a signaling function for why Bobby drives to the store because the easy explanation is he drives there because he wants to get food or whatever, and that's an efficient way of traveling. When we do want to add a signaling explanation is if the behavior can't be explained by some sort of rational function. Right? So, like, why does he walk in the cold with his shirt off? That doesn't seem rational. Okay, then we might look for a signaling function. Like, is it communicating something to somebody? I'm not sure. I haven't thought this through. I think it might be a principle. I don't know. It's
Okay.
only tangentially related to punishment anyway, I
Okay.
suppose.
Well, what we wanted to discuss, I think, a little bit is just how punishment has gotten much more humane over time. Historically, you know, people not only would we torture people, but we would torture people on the street in front of other people and cheer um, about other people being brutally tortured in front of us. And we so we've gotten more humane over time, but we've also outsourced the punishment to, well, we outsource
Well, this is
punishment
the
to
same
government.
process. Yeah, so I think this is important that it's basically the process of outsourcing physical violence. What
Presumably because we've decided it's not okay to let people handle their own retribution.
right. So let's think about first. Like
Well,
we
let's
would start.
explain what you mean by outsourcing first.
Yeah, well, we're gonna get there
Okay.
first. So let's think about human societies at first. Each person or maybe their group would punish other people. There
Mm-hmm.
was no governmental entity that would punish others. And often that kind of punishment is rather brutal,
Yeah.
right? So human desires for retribution are pretty powerful and they also can lead to these escalating cycles of, the Hatfield McCoy thing where you have an escalating feud. At some point in human history, obviously it didn't happen overnight, but at some point punishment was basically outsourced. That is to say, humans gave up, citizens gave up the right to take vengeance on their own, and they
Mm-hmm.
gave the government the power to punish other people. That is to say, the government secured a monopoly on the legitimate use of force.
Mm-hmm. Presumably
Right.
because this people were treated more fairly this way. Um,
I'm not sure that that makes sense.
why else would people do it if they weren't afraid of being, for example, falsely accused of something and then being killed because someone mistakenly,
I
uh,
think that the government just imposed its will on people. And
maybe.
one thing about these cycles of vengeance is that they're particularly ruinous to group functioning. So from the perspective of a government, it's not good to have people in your group constantly taking vengeance upon each other.
Killing each other. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Now I mean, Pinker goes over some of this in Better Angels, and there are other people who have described it. It's obviously a complicated process. So we're just going to skip over the complicated details and say that when you do outsource it, then you get this slow process of what we might call rationalizing punishment. That
Mm-hmm.
is very strong concern, especially during the Enlightenment. You see this concern with proportional punishment. The notion that, you know what, if somebody stole it wouldn't be a Snickers at the time, but let's
Mm-hmm.
just pretend if somebody stole a Snickers, we're not going to cut their arm off. Like,
Right.
we're going to make a punishment that's proportionate to
I
the
was
crime.
reading something the other day. You used to be able to be killed for like pickpocketing. Like that was a capital
Oh,
crime. You would be
yeah,
killed for stealing like a
right.
few
So
whatever pounds or
that's
dollars.
that's something that I think people don't understand. So I remember I was looking through, I mean, Pinker has a lot of this in his
Mm-hmm.
book also, but uh, they were going over capital crimes in England in, say, 1750 or
Mm-hmm.
something, and the number of capital crimes was just
It was like
outrageous.
thousands of
Yeah,
things,
I
and then
mean,
it cut back to like 200, and then like
right,
five.
and so it slowly, yeah, it slowly winnows out these crimes. Now, it's interesting too is that the punishment was grisly and it was very public. So
Mm-hmm.
people would hang in gibbets in the public, and this is in the 1700s, mind
Yeah,
you, in the
not that
most,
long ago.
yeah, in the most sophisticated city in the world, perhaps at the time. I mean, debatable, but London. And you would have people hanging in gibbets, and families would go out and bet on when they die. People would throw rotten fruit at them, etc. Right?
Yeah. And people need to realize that we are like the same people basically as the people
Yes,
then that tolerate
yes.
not only tolerated it but seem to find like pleasure in.
Seem to enjoy it. Yeah, yeah. It's not just toleration; it's absolute excitement at the spectacle of public punishment.
Yeah.
Um,
And that
and as you
was,
said, yeah.
oh sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I think it is important to say, as you said, this is, say, 1700. So even people who believe in rapid evolution don't think that there was a lot of change in human psychology since then. So we're
Yeah.
basically the same people who were throwing rotten fruit at dying people in gibbets.
Yeah. So we should assume we are all capable, or most of us are capable of that kind of behavior, which I guess will bring us to the main theme, which is that we've kind of recreated a platform for that kind of public shaming punishment that was pretty much outlawed when we decided that government should handle punishment and we're going to only punish people to the degree that they should be punished. We're not going to torture people. We're not going to publicly humiliate people. Um, and those, I guess, our desire to participate in that kind of activity was potentially unsatisfied for a while. And then now we have social media and people can, it's almost like pulling the government away again and letting just the mob get to people.
Right. So that's a complicated idea with a short segue. So let me try to fill in the details for a second. So I think an important thing about the punishment, let's say in the 1700s, the people taking delight at these grisly spectacles, is it was probably satisfying our proximate desire for retribution in a
Mm-hmm.
way that 1990s justice didn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened slowly, though, is that society more and more rationalized punishment, got rid of a lot of these, what we would consider now barbaric forms of punishment. And you're always walking this delicate line as a society, because if you don't punish enough, people will take the law into their own hands. But you
Yeah.
don't want to punish too much because we've discovered, and maybe we're just a more beneficent society because we can afford to be, but also we've discovered that, hey, it's just not rational to punish in that brutal of a way anymore. So on the one, so you have this just precipitous decline in the barbarism of punishment for a long time. And now what Cory was saying is that we may be seeing, at least to a degree, a sort of reversion to this more atavistic desire to revel in the spectacle of human suffering, so
Mm-hmm.
long as those people suffering committed a transgression that that makes them deserving of it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this would be Twitter would be a good example of this, because on Twitter you don't have the outsourced punishment, right? There's
Right.
no uh, force that's punishing people for transgressions. Rather, there are just individuals interacting, right?
Right. And one thing I find kind of interesting, so people do, you do get like the Twitter mobs, uh, coming like criticizing people who actually did commit immoral actions, people who actually are going to go to jail or prison, Brock Turner or Larry Nasser, people who, or Bill Cosby, people like this who are actually going to go to prison. But you get a lot of these Twitter mobs are focused on actions that are legal and they're just norm violations of a particular kind that the government doesn't have authority over. And so it almost seems as though people feel that they have to take matters into their own hands because there isn't a higher authority that's going to do anything about um, certain types of moral violations that we've decided shouldn't be punished by the state.
Yeah, I think that that's probably the sort of charitable reading, and I'm not so predisposed to that view. I
Okay.
think morality, again, it's a, an inextricably tribal phenomenon. It's
Mm-hmm.
about setting rules for a tribe and then advertising those rules. And what Twitter is this enormous world of opinions that may violate your tribe's rules. And when
Mm-hmm.
people see something that violates their tribe's rules, they like to punish the person to signal that they're maintaining their tribe's rules and that they are indeed faithful members of some such tribe. And furthermore, humans appear to have a nearly insatiable desire for inflicting pain and suffering on those who violate their tribe's sacred values. And so Twitter is essentially a platform almost perfectly designed just to allow people to satisfy that, to try to satisfy that desire over and over again.
But you would agree that many of the most prominent cases of like Twitter mobs that actually caused real damage to other people, to people's lives,
Mm-hmm.
um, a lot of them are for sort of moderate infractions. People aren't uh, expressing outrage about a lot of, murders and things that get posted. Maybe a news story gets passed around about something someone did, but that
Yes, that's
doesn't
probably true.
inspire people to, if you want to call it signaling their loyalty to their tribe by being outraged, it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
inspire people to do that, when you're talking about behaviors that actually
Mm-hmm.
are illegal and that actually will be punished properly by the state.
Mm-hmm.
Except in
Yeah,
the case of
that's
Brock Turner, but the outrage in that case was
was that
because
he
his
wasn't
punishment wasn't
punished. Yeah,
sufficient.
yeah. No, okay, so that there might be something to that. That's an excellent point. I'd have to think about that carefully before I commented intelligently. But that does seem as though it's a good point that there may be something in some ways rational about it, because yeah, when there actually is formal punishment, people don't seem to signal their disgust about it as much on Twitter, do they? They're not like, yeah, this
They
person's in
do
jail and they deserve it as much
they
as
do
they do.
occasionally, but not.
Sure,
I'm thinking like
not
Larry
as
Nasser.
much.
People were
Sure, but the thing
upset
with
about
Larry
that.
Nasser was he wasn't punished yet either.
Right.
So let's imagine that
Presumably,
this
people mostly stopped talking about it afterward, which I think they
right when he
did.
got consecutive life sentences. Let's say, I mean, people probably, yeah, they probably did at least denunciations of him calmed down
Mm-hmm.
probably. So that is okay. So that that's possible. There may be some quasi-rational component to this. But what we also should know, and what's troubling about this, is because I think we both believe, right, that the human brain is prone to a very dangerous emotion, which is self-righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
And self-righteousness is this very satisfying feeling of ridiculing, harassing, assailing a person who has violated some norm that you think is important. And self-righteousness is one of the most, I would say it's like, it's not dehumanizing actually, though. It's interesting in that it's humanizing in the sense that you actually want the person to
Mm-hmm.
experience, unspeakable suffering. It
It's
just
Paul
turns
Bloom's
people.
argument.
Yeah, that's right. That is Paul Bloom's argument, and I think it's correct. And so in a sense, self-righteousness turns people into self-satisfied sadists. They're being sadistic, but they're satisfied in their own sadism. They're
Yeah.
actually defending it as for the greater good. And because you and I both accept that that's probably true and that self-righteousness is dangerous, Twitter is a particularly problematic web platform because it provokes self-righteousness so quickly and easily.
Yeah, and I guess we should draw the contrast to selfishness since we put that in our title. What I find kind of, well, we could change the title,
Yes,
but
that's true.
what I find interesting about, I think a lot of people think a lot of moral harm is caused by mere selfish behavior. So this would be things like robbing a bank or a store because you're trying to get money, or when people are selfish in their social relationships, they cause harm to other people. But the harm in those cases, in cases of selfish behavior, is not the goal. It's a side effect, and presumably a person who's being selfish would avoid harming another person if they could. They just want
Right.
the money, or they just want to have sex with someone while they're in a monogamous relationship with someone else. They're trying to satisfy some other selfish goal, um, and the harm is an undesirable side effect of that action, and they would like to not harm anyone. With self
Right.
righteousness, the harm is the goal, and not only is it the goal, but it's perceived as a virtuous goal. The harm is
It's a positive good.
it's
Yeah.
a positive good. So a person in
Right.
that case wouldn't try to minimize harm the way a selfish person presumably would, at least in some cases. They would try to maximize harm, and you probably couldn't reason with them in the way you could potentially reason with a selfish person. If you could point out the harm to a selfish person, that might be convincing. If you point out the harm to a self-righteous person, that would just make them want to do it even more.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, so you and I, of course, are working on this paper right now, which makes these arguments. And of course, other people have argued something similar, but we want to put it together and make it as provocative as possible. And the point here, I mean, I do think this is why the comparison with a sadist is particularly appropriate. Because
Mm-hmm.
unlike the selfish person who commits a crime, the sadist's goal is the suffering of the victim.
Mm-hmm.
And the same holds for the self righteous person. The self righteous person's goal is to cause suffering. The reason selfish people, in many ways, are easier to deal with is because you can just change the incentive structure in society and you change their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
They have a relatively rational goal and they don't really care if they hurt other people to get it. But if you make the consequences of hurting other people steep enough, then they
Mm-hmm.
won't climb that hill anymore. On the
Mm-hmm.
other hand, self righteous people will climb the hill just to cause the pain because that is their goal,
Right.
right? And this is why, and you and I have had this discussion on this podcast before, why the noble intentions or they have good intentions argument is relatively unappealing to me because good
Yeah.
intentions often lead to the most destructive behaviors as evidenced by French Revolution, Communist Revolution, etc.
Yeah, as desperately as I want to believe that good intentions are generally good. Obviously, they can also be some of the most catastrophic things as well.
Right. So, I mean, our advisor likes to make this point, our ex-advisor, our colleague, Roy
He can always be
Baumeister.
our advisor.
Yeah, he likes to make this point, and I think it's a good point, which is people, in some sense, people are confused about what comprises most pro-social behavior. So when people think pro-social behavior, they think running across the street to help like a dying kid or picking up a woman and saving her from a rapist. But actually, the most pro-social behavior in a modern society is selfish. It is Steve Jobs pursuing
Mm.
his desire to make profit. And the side effect is everybody benefits from these wonderful products. I think the same might hold like for perceived destructiveness. That is to say, we don't see cynical people seem bad to us in some ways. Self-righteous, I'm sorry, not self-righteous, the opposite of self-righteous, that is selfish people seem bad to us, whereas actually they're probably contributing a lot to society as long as you structure the right incentives.
Mhm.
And self-righteous people often are praised because they appear to have good motives, but those good motives often lead to terrible behavior. So like looking at the motives isn't always the best thing to do. Sometimes you really just want to look at the outcome and how manipulable the behavior is.
Yeah, that is a good point. You look at people's desire for status, for example, and you kind of like judge it and think it's superficial, and it seems to be something people should be ashamed of, but in many cases, it's going to lead people to be very productive and to want to help other people and to do all kinds of great things. Um,
Right. I mean, if it weren't for the desire for status, we'd have almost nothing as a society because it's like it's the primary motivation of cultural achievement.
yeah, yeah. Why we have movies.
So this, yes. So this self-righteousness is, in some sense, I think of Twitter. I'm pretty good at ignoring a lot of stuff on there now. But if you look at
Should
how
we give
most
some of the
people use
classic
it,
examples?
yeah, I was going to get to that in just a
Yeah,
second. So
okay.
good point, yes. But I just want to point out it may be the case that the best way to think of Twitter is that it's a self-righteousness generating machine. I mean, I really think for a lot of people, what they do is they go on and they look for some tweet that they
Hmm.
vehemently disagree. They feel a peak of righteousness and they fire off their signal tweet and then they feel a little bit better and move on.
Right. Yeah, so
Um,
Molly Crockett kind of argues that social media is basically designed to cause outrage in people and for people to want to
mhm,
signal their outrage. So, in many
right.
cases, it can be anonymous. If you're anonymous, there are virtually no costs at all to calling someone you disagree with a bad name. But I think actually, probably even more often than that, it's not anonymous. It's
Right. I
people
agree.
who, as we've been saying, are trying to signal to their in group, this is a cause that I care about. It's a cause you all care about too. I'm like a really important member of this in group, or I'm a really loyal member of this in group. Um, but what makes social media the sort of ideal place for people to do this is that it actually it has potential to be very rewarding. It has your tweet could go viral and you could get tons of followers and people could know who you are, you can get status. And
Hmm.
it can have really little chance of having any kind of negative consequences, particularly if you're only followed by people who already like you and already know you. If you ridicule somebody, the odds of them disagreeing with you are going to be pretty low. There are really no risks involved, but potential for reward
Well,
is
they'll
pretty high.
probably disagree with you, right? I mean,
The
if you
person you're
ridicule, yeah, the person you're
ridiculing,
ridiculing will disagree, but yeah, the threat of any kind of physical conflict or escalation is virtually zero.
Also, you can just like delete your tweet, and probably more often than not, it's
Well,
fine.
that doesn't
Some people have
always
been burned
work.
by that strategy, but
Yeah, because we can kind of
because we've
analyze
wised up and started
these.
taking screenshots. But
Right. So let's think about this kind of analysis, maybe with a concrete example or two. So my
hmm
example is Justine Sacco, and
yeah,
I should have looked this
she's
up
probably the
beforehand,
most famous example.
right? I'm embarrassed that I didn't, but she was employed by somebody, I don't remember who. She wasn't
A
in.
it was some I looked it up because she's been rehired. She works for them again, and
Oh,
she's like
okay.
the head of their corporate something or other for Match.com and OkCupid and blah blah blah, all these things.
Okay. So she's a white woman and she was going to Africa, and before she got on the plane, as I understand it, or maybe even before the plane took off, she
hmm
fired off a tweet which read, "Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white."
hmm
Now, the tweet, of course, is a joke. It's a meta
So she
joke.
says.
So anybody with a brain could understand. And obviously, it's making fun of white privilege, and she's being ironic. So she fires this off and thinks, I fired off a joke, whatever, and then gets on her plane. And by the time she
She had
lands,
like 120 followers or something.
yeah, so
Yeah.
she's not expecting that this is going to do anything. By the time she lands, like she's already like public enemy number one, because people had seen her tweet and they were outraged by it. They thought that it was, just disgustingly and despicably racist. And she ended up getting fired, I believe.
She
And
was
her,
fired before she even landed, I believe.
oh,
And then
okay.
there was like
Okay.
a hashtag, has Justine landed yet? Because her
Okay.
flight was like
Yes.
11 hours long,
Yeah.
and she was a
Yeah.
celebrity within like the first few and had no idea
She
until
was
she landed.
a celebrity in like the worst way
Yeah.
possible, right? Sort of like a Hannibal Lecter celebrity.
Yeah.
So this is one example of Twitter
So
mobs.
the reason people were offended, people thought that she was sort of making light of the AIDS situation, and like
Yes,
she had no position to be making a joke about.
because well, I think they thought it was racist as
They
well.
thought it
They
was racist,
interpreted
but
it as
specifically
being callously
because,
racist.
yeah,
Yeah,
about a real problem that people face.
correct.
Yeah.
Yes. So how much shame she deserved. I'm on the 0%. It was actually a funny, self aware joke that was, in fact, making fun of white privilege, quote unquote white privilege.
Mhm.
People can disagree, reasonable
Well,
people, of
I'll
course.
play devil's advocate for you and just say that you could think that she really was making an insensitive joke. She said it was ironic after the fact to try to justify what she said. But even in that case, I would say, how much should someone be punished for
It's
making an insensitive joke? Probably they
right.
shouldn't lose their job. And
Okay, okay,
probably
so
like only 50 people should call you racist. I don't know
I,
what the
I mean,
appropriate number
the
of.
okay. Let me point out that the devil's advocate position
Yeah, the devil's advocate
it
positions
is
like
in fact risible, because it would be so suppose that I fired off a tweet that said, Hitler was a pretty good guy. Wish I could have met him. Now, unless you're functioning with few
someone is going to crop
neurons,
that out and post it online.
right? Now, unless you have only a few functional neurons, you understand that that's an ironic statement, because anybody who knows anything about history would never say that. Likewise, anybody should know that she's not so stupid that she thinks that literally white people are immune from HIV. Like, obviously, she understands that. So, right there is an indication that she's being ironic, right? So, I find the devil's advocate argument like, look, if we're going to be regulated, if our jokes are going to be regulated by the stupidest people out there, that's a problem, right? Right, but like we want to be able to tell jokes and be ironic without having the person who doesn't understand the irony regulate that, I would
I am a fan of jokes.
think. You are?
But Yeah, I think the point is, even if we
Yeah,
say it was
that's
just
fair.
an offensive statement, even if it
Right,
was just an insensitive statement, which it could
right.
be fine, it could be probably like being a notorious racist is not a proportionate punishment to the crime, and losing your job is probably not proportionate.
I would
And I
hope
think
we
she
could
was
just
getting
agree
death
that
threats and things. I think,
I would hope that we don't even have to qualify with the adverb probably. So
yeah.
it somewhat reminds me of an inquisition or a cultural revolution in which you force somebody who has the wrong beliefs or who said the wrong thing to put on a dunce cap and flagellate themselves publicly before you decide whether you will let them back into decent society. That's what it reminds me of. And there are other examples of this. Perhaps you can forward one that if you have one that you are interested in,
Um, I mean,
or an
there
example
are
that's.
a lot of them. If you want to do a recent one, you could do the the woman. What was her book? I actually can't remember her name even, so that's maybe a
Oh
bad
yeah,
example.
yes. So there was this young author,
Hmm.
author of a young author's book.
Yes.
Amelia Zhao, I believe was her name. I
Yeah,
may
yeah.
be mis.
Or Zhao, yeah.
Yeah, and yes. So she was taken down
Hmm.
by a Twitter mob and other online mobs for apparent racism because so one thing that people objected to, if you can imagine this, is that one of the blurbs on the book was, in this world, like the oppression's not based on color.
Yeah, something like that.
So because it was a fantasy set in a fictional universe, and
Hmm.
people were outraged and suggested that showed like
It was
apparently
it was
some
a combination
cruelty.
of
Okay, but
things.
that was one thing
That
that
was one
was
of them. Yeah,
pointed out. I like that you're trying to be charitable to these people,
I
but
am
in
trying.
this case, I feel as though you're the person who's like, the Inquisition was pretty cool. They were doing things. Okay, so one thing they
One
got mad
thing.
about was the colorblind oppression because they
Yes.
felt as though that was racist and callous because real oppression in this world is based on color. And then also they thought that she had played on the quote unquote magical Negro trope. So
Hmm.
this is a trope in which you have this character who basically just serves a plot function and they're an
Hmm.
African American and then they're completely disposable, right?
Yep. And she
Yes.
had a
And so
character that may or may not have been,
we don't, yeah, she was described as tawny, I believe was
and
the
and
adjective.
bronze were the
Yeah,
two.
bronze and tawny, which, could refer to a number of different people, of course, or different
Hmm.
ethnic groups, if you will.
Yep.
And so these
One thing that I
people,
thought was kind of funny was that apparently this person also had blue eyes, and people are like, "Why does the black person have blue eyes?"
oh, is that right?
It's like maybe they weren't supposed to be black,
That's
but
confirmation bias, isn't it?
but anyway, we're not
Hey, why is
100%.
the black person white? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. But anyway,
Yeah,
so
so these mobs they were trampling so loudly that she ended up forwarding this abject apology and then saying she wasn't going to publish her book,
yeah, so
which
potentially like a career making thing for her. She could have had a very successful writing career. And she might still release the book in
she
the future and
probably
change some
will
things about it.
change
And
it.
her
Yeah,
her apology seemed very authentic.
she'll
And
run it
in
through the
fairness, I
social
think
justice.
people kind of were accepting of her apology,
Yeah, I
so
saw
maybe
people.
that's
Yeah,
something.
yeah. I mean, if you genuflect enough to the Inquisition, then maybe they'll let you back in. So maybe the social justice Inquisition will be happy with her apologies. We'll have to
I
find
mean, I
out.
think it's important to point out that uh, some things probably should be shamed, and it's maybe good that people do that
Oh,
sometimes.
I completely agree. So I'm not attempting to forward a view of the universe in which we get rid of all shame.
Right. The thing is,
I
with
want to
these
get rid
Twitter
of
mobs in
shame for
particular, they tend
trivial.
to be too many people piling on. and they're often not proportionate to the offense because
Right. That
anytime there are millions of people or even thousands of people, it's going to be disproportionate to
well,
some sort
I
of
would be
legal but potentially offensive behavior.
yes, yeah. Well, I would say as a general champion of free speech and imputation of charitable motives or
Mm-hmm.
charitable imputations, that I would submit that in these cases, people shouldn't even have been irritated at all, and that the
Yeah,
proportionate
probably
response
not.
would be nothing. I agree with you in other cases. So maybe like a more, well, maybe I don't agree with I was going to say maybe the Liam Neeson one would be more, but I'm not even sure that I feel
Yeah,
that
no, the
way on
Liam
there.
Neeson one's
I'm trying to
probably a
think of,
good one because, yeah, obviously having a
well,
desire.
well, let's say what Liam Neeson did first.
Yeah, so his female friend revealed to him that she had been raped by a black man at some prior point, and he was outraged, and he confessed apparently to going into neighborhoods that were predominantly black and looking to get in some kind of altercation with any random black person so he could
Right.
unleash his desire for revenge on any member of the race.
Right. And so
Um,
let's be clear that this is something that he confessed that happened about
mhm,
40 years ago. And he also clearly said it was horrifying and like disgusting to him.
yeah,
And, it was clearly a thought, so we'd say thought processes and behavioral processes, because as you said, he said he actually went out and
yeah.
looked to provoke somebody that he was clearly ashamed of, and one could even say mortified by. And now, so I learned, I'm embarrassed that I didn't know this term before this, but I learned this term. It's called canceling somebody.
Hmm.
So this is when the Inquisition just says you're out.
Right,
You no longer can participate in public life. Bye, right?
right,
And so people were calling. Well, I mean, they did cancel his red carpet at the premiere of his movie, and
right.
uh, as far as I could tell, and I looked through it a little bit, people were still pretty forcefully on the cancel Liam Neeson
Yeah,
train.
so this is a less ambiguous case because what
Less ambiguous
less
or more?
ambiguous, less
Oh, okay.
ambiguous,
Okay.
because what he did was, I think everyone would agree, was wrong.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. What he did was wrong.
and it
Yes.
was like the having the thoughts were bad enough, but then to actually engage in the
Sure.
behavior is pretty disgusting. And you could say, okay, well, he knew he was wrong and he's changed. It was a long time ago. Maybe that minimizes it to some extent. I think people also thought it was in poor taste to use this as like a promotional tool, which potentially,
That's outrageous. He wasn't using it as a
yes,
promotional
huh? He was
tool.
talking about it in his
Yes,
interview.
huh?
Yes, huh?
I'm done then. Okay. No, but I mean,
Case
the
closed.
point is, this story, it's not as if he,
That's
like,
not the worst part of what happened, for sure.
well, also, it's not as if he like planned this ahead. He was talking about how he got into the mind of a character who was seeking revenge, and this story just happened to come out. So I
Okay.
mean, it's not as if he was attempting to manufacture
Nonetheless,
controversy.
people don't like when you're trying to seek some kind of, well, he did not get a positive outcome from telling me the
No, there
story.
was
But being like,
definitely not a
look
positive
how
outcome.
much I can relate to my character. I'm going to be awesome at playing this character. But anyway, yeah. So what he did was unambiguously bad.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
do what he did was not illegal. Do we know how much punishment he deserves? Um,
Well, for one thing, it happened 40 years ago, so there's
happened
got to be
40
like
years ago.
a kind of statute of limitations.
Yeah. So like if it was illegal to go looking to provoke a fight,
Right.
how
Even if
much
it were illegal, which it's not because we can't read people's minds, but even if it were, 40 years later, I don't think we would be punishing people for that crime.
but let's say even if we did punish him, it probably would
Hmm.
be like a year in jail or something at most.
What?
I'm
Man,
saying
you live in a punitive universe. I thought I
I'm
was
trying
supposed
to
to be
give
the
the
punitive
absolute
one.
most extreme case of how much we think he should be punished for that. He shouldn't be canceled, is my point.
Well, of course he shouldn't be canceled, but I mean, suppose that I said to you, yeah, 2 days ago I
I'm
went to the
not
bar.
I'm
Hold on,
suggesting this as a
I'm
maximum, an upper limit on what
so
people who are very upset would say. People
okay.
who are really angry about it, what would they say would be a fair punishment?
So clearly the concern here is not that he was trying to provoke a fight, because as British people would say, millions of blokes do that every day. The concern is, I don't know if they do actually or
But
not.
not on
That's
the basis of race membership.
right, exactly. That's the bigger concern, is that he was carrying out some kind of racial vengeance, which
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely despicable. And in fact, it's one of my complaints against what people do on the other side of this issue, is they make things indicative of some sort of racial battle when it should be about individuals. So I think we should be able to say, and I don't think he sufficiently did this either, what was heinous about what he said was the racial classification, right? The fact that he was like, I'm going to get punishment on black people or
Right.
black men in general. That's,
Mm-hmm.
yes, that's disgusting. And I don't know that he grappled with that as well as he could have. I think it's pretty clear that he's not the best at handling these kinds of things. And he was trying to make this confession and trying to, in some sense, atone for it. And instead, people were clamoring to cancel him. And I think I agree with you. The crime is true. It's definitely something we would want to say that's not cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
The question is, should we be canceling people for confessing like dark thoughts or behaviors? And I think not only is it disproportionate punishment, but also it actually discourages people from having important conversations. Because who's going to want to come out and say, yeah, you know what, this one time I had a misogynistic thought and I had to really check myself, if
Mm-hmm.
merely saying that is enough to get you punished?
Yeah. Yeah. So you'd want to think about that. Um, I mean, I think you can just objectively show that it's canceling someone if the term really means basically your life's over, no one's going to associate with you anymore. It's
Well,
too
I guess your public life.
your public life. Um,
Yeah.
is too harsh because had he actually gone through with it and had he actually committed a hate crime against someone, what
Hmm.
would the prison sentence for that be? Like if he beat someone up? I suppose it depends on the outcome of that.
Yeah, it depends on the outcome. I mean, for example, Mark Wahlberg literally committed a hate crime against an Asian person, so far as I know. I shouldn't talk a lot about that because I guess I don't know the details, but I mean,
I
he's
didn't know that
very
actually.
profusely apologetic about it, and certainly he lived a different lifestyle then. But yeah, I mean, I had a thought about that. Well, I don't know what it was. It
The point
escaped
is that
me,
it'd be
as so
a
many brilliant
finite
ones do.
sentence. There'd be a
Yes,
finite punishment.
it would be a finite punishment. That is absolutely correct. And the 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 canceling. Oh, here's an. This is what I was going to say, and it's related to a lot of these cases. Not Justine Sacco, because she was just somebody living her life. She was a private citizen. But in a lot of these cases, you get these pile-ups on, say, Brett Kavanaugh or Liam Neeson, etc.
Mm-hmm.
People who are public figures. And one thing that often is said is, well, they don't have a right to
Mm-hmm.
this. So people will say that about Neeson. He doesn't have a right to be an actor. Why would I feel sorry for this like privileged white male? And I think that's a very disturbing way of thinking, because if you earn something in our society, then you do have a right to it. That's like the principle of private property, which is one of the most inviolable principles of any kind of functioning Western society, right?
Well, prepare to be disturbed because
Prepared.
I kind of am sympathetic with that argument, particularly in the case of Kavanaugh, and I've mentioned this to you before, that in these are privileged, very, very privileged positions that almost nobody gets. Nobody gets to be a millionaire, famous actor. Nobody
Sure.
get, yeah, nobody gets to be um, one of the most famous politicians in the whole entire world with tons of power. These are privileges, and to demand near perfection from the people who get these privileged positions, I don't know if it's that unreasonable.
Well, okay, so I think that's a different question. Now, let's. I would object to the term privilege. It's something that people earn. I
They
agree that
do
you.
earn it, but part of earning it, given that the public cares about who's representing them, and
Hmm.
both politically and maybe in the media as well,
Hmm.
I think your moral reputation is extremely important. And if you have a blemish that people care about, maybe that should disqualify you.
Okay, well, yeah, but that okay. So I think that's a separate point, though. So I think the point I would make is it the claim that this is some kind of like privilege and why should we care about these rich white men, I
Hmm.
find disturbing because it's something people earn. You work really hard and you have a lot of talents and then you earn things in our society, and those aren't privileges, those are earned. Liam Neeson has earned all of his money by being an incredibly talented and hardworking
It's
actor.
probably
Brett
partially
Kavanaugh.
earned it and partially just got lucky, which I suspect most
Oh,
actors
oh,
have.
but
Same
but
with
but if
Kavanaugh.
okay, right, but if you want to go that route, everybody got lucky because everybody nobody
Yeah,
chooses their
and I
genes.
would
Okay.
say that everyone gets lucky.
Well, be that as it may, I still think it's important to have the concept of earned things and private property. I'm not going to go to your, take your stuff and just say, you got lucky and we don't care about you, so we're taking your stuff. That is what you do in dictatorships when you just take things from the unfavored political
But
party.
these are factors into their deservingness.
Well, that's a different question, right? Now,
It's
if you're
not, it's the
saying
same question. It's one of their qualifications if you're going to be a
no,
Supreme Court
because
justice or the president of the United States. Granted,
right,
that's
but if you
weird, but
say okay, if you okay, so like if people have this desire, obviously, to punish and take down public figures, even more so than ordinary figures, and if we say to them, okay, if you make an accusation
yeah.
against anybody who's attempting to secure a high-powered position,
Hmm.
then that's enough to remove them because it's a privileged position and they should be morally unblemished. You're just going to take everybody down.
But that's a different
Because,
argument. You're worried about the incentive structure that that would create.
well, yeah,
But if
absolutely.
these are actual legitimate accusations that aren't being used for political games,
Well, I think
then,
everybody agrees with that, though. I don't think there were. Okay, so I
well,
mean,
that's
I
the
got.
case in Kavanaugh. I mean, I think we all think that that was a legitimate accusation. Not necessarily we know that it happened, but it was
No, no, no.
believed that it happened.
No, no, no. I don't agree with that. I think most. Uh, let's put it this way. I think whether one thought that it happened or not, I think most people who supported his nomination,
Hmm.
including me, thought that the evidence didn't cross the 50% threshold.
But I
I
think
didn't.
you and most people think that her accusation was legitimate in that she believed it really happened
Oh
and she
yeah,
wasn't making it
absolutely.
up for a political
Yes.
stunt.
Oh, absolutely. Agree. Totally
Yeah,
agree
so
with
I'm
that.
saying there's a
Yes.
difference between false accusations. Granted, it's hard to tell the difference between the two, but I'm saying when you're talking about,
Right. I mean, don't you think that the evidence is what matters, though? We can't read the motivations of the
yeah,
accusers,
I'm not
although
I'm not saying that um I actually don't know how I feel about the Kavanaugh case. I haven't landed on a position on it yet. I probably
That's
won't.
fair.
It's complicated, but
It is.
but let's say still, I might say that even though obviously he's not going to be punished for what he did, but I still think if the accusation was compelling enough, it could be used to no longer support his nomination because of the blemish.
I agree with. I think if the accusation crossed the 50 percentile, like civil court um, threshold, then I would be seriously concerned about him. Yes, even though that's an older crime, because in that case, that would be an actually attempted rape that was traumatizing to another person. Whereas the Neeson one, he didn't even confront another person, so far as we know, right? There's no
Right.
evidence that he did. So he's basically confessing thoughts and bad behaviors that led to no consequences.
Right.
And so I think then, though, we both agree basically that um, the notion that somebody's quote unquote privilege shouldn't really allow people to punish them more, should it? I mean, in fact,
If the
the the
punishment is
the
stripping them
pun.
of this like really, really high status
Mhm.
that most people don't get unless they're
Mhm.
basically flawless, then
Well, but no, I don't think anybody would accuse Hollywood actors of being flawless.
sure.
Not sure that that's on
Different actors get
the
status
application.
through different routes.
Sure.
So some people, it's the fact that they're full of flaws that get
Let
them.
me say what I find concerning is I think that proportional punishment, as we talked about, and
Mm-hmm.
also I understand that due process is a principle that applies to the legal system and maybe not public
Mm-hmm.
opinion. I think that there should be some kind of due process that that works in the public sphere as well. These things, proportionate punishment and due process, go against human nature in many ways. It's
Mm-hmm.
really difficult to convince people that you should give up your desire to seek vengeance and allow the state to do this rational punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also really hard to convince people that, you know what, maybe you're 65% convinced that this person did it, but that's not enough and we're not going to punish the person.
Right.
So, because it's so hard to convince people of these things, when you start encouraging them to go in the other direction, you're basically encouraging them to go downhill. That is, with the wind and on a decline, where they're going to their bicycle of punishment
Yeah.
desires is just going to go faster and
They
faster,
do
and
not
that's what
need any
concerns me.
encouragement. That is
Yeah,
true.
exactly, and yeah, and that's what disconcerts me about this is I think we should be very careful about encouraging these propensities.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I would agree with that. You absolutely do not need to encourage people to be more outraged than they just will be all on their own.
Right,
And if
and
anything, I would say in many, if not most cases, it would be better if we could leave legal actions to the legal authorities, and then for personal infractions, if people's immediate friends and family want to criticize them, then that's one thing. But having thousands or hundreds of thousands of strangers on social media probably almost always isn't the way to go, or was almost never the way to go.
yeah, or I
And
mean,
though I think no one actually cares about this, because I don't think people really care about, people don't express moral outrage for like rational reasons, but there is some research showing that when people do pile on
mhm,
to people for like ambiguously racist comments, let's say, people start to sympathize with the person who's the victim of the mob, the outrage mob.
right, right.
So it actually can be counterproductive if people care about that, which I'm assuming they really don't.
Yeah, and I mean, I think of these cases. So let's take the Sacco case, for
Hmm.
example. I mean, suppose people just had a sense of humor, and instead of mobbing her, they just kind of chuckled about it. Would our world be any worse? No, it wouldn't. In fact, it would be better
We
because
wouldn't have anything to talk about.
people would be a little more mirthful. Well, they could talk about how it was funny. Or Liam Neeson. What if, I don't think their people should applaud, but what if
Mm-mm.
people had a conversation and they said, you know what, this kind of racial vendetta is abhorrent and
Hmm.
exactly why we need to be careful about these things. And good on Neeson for admitting these dark
Well, I don't think you need to
feelings.
praise him, but
Oh, I think praising people sometimes judiciously for confessing sort of dark thoughts is
it's probably
sometimes it's
okay to have a pretty nuanced opinion and be like, what you did was absolutely disgusting,
right.
but admitting it would be hard. And
Yeah, and
maybe
it's
it does help some
probably
people
we
have a
we
conversation.
can have a conversation about this. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Kavanaugh's a little bit different because a lot of that depends on if you believe the accusation, right? So that's harder to deal with. But I guess Mike, I think we're probably
We're
running out
about
of
out of
time, huh?
time, yeah.
Okay, so my concluding point would be, and you and I are working on this paper now,
Hmm.
moralistic emotions are probably they're both beautiful and destructive. They're like a I don't know, like a mighty mountain that one wants to climb, right? It's beautiful and it's deadly. They're sublime, right? And we should probably discourage anything that plays on our natural propensity to punish because we don't, as you said, we don't need to pour any fuel on that fire. It's already raging enough. And I'm concerned that some new ideologies or narratives coupled with social media is leading to some kind of encouragement,
Hmm.
not even like a tacit endorsement, but rather a positive encouragement of mobocracy. And also, I'll just say this, my concluding thing, what terrifies me in the United States, because I'm broadcasting from an undisclosed location here, is that the Democratic Party has essentially embraced this very what I would consider antithetical to American values, this concept of just believe whoever accuses somebody, which is an incredible violation of due process, and then punishing people for things they did in 1987 or something. I'm actually horrified. As I said, like, I don't really like tribes, but I don't want to belong to a tribe that might dig up something I wrote in 2005 and then like humiliate me publicly. So I'm very concerned about these things, and I think it's really important to try to understand them. Be charitable, of course, but understand them and then debate the bad ideas.
Good advice.
Okay. Do you have any concluding statements?
Not really, but only maybe I would say that if you're capable of not expressing outrage and piling on to an already massive pile of moral outrage, then you should use it because most people can't help themselves.
Yes. Use that impulse
Use your self
control
control.
wisely.
All
Yes. All right.
right, I'll talk to you later.